Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Supervision Simplified. I am Dr. Amy Parks.
And I am Valarie Harris. Welcome.
And we are so excited to have you back with us today. Today, we're going to be talking about something that lots of people ask us about all the time, and that is supervision contracts and a little bit of paperwork. So we're not going to go into all the different supervision paperwork because there can be quite a lot, although you can certainly very successfully accomplish 200 hours of supervision without looking at a single piece of paper. But supervision contracts are something that lots and lots of people ask us about. And in fact, I would venture to say that of all the things that you could do in supervision, the one thing that you could do really badly could be not doing a contract at all. And there are some states in the United States that don't require supervision contracts. And I would also venture to say that that would probably be a bad idea to not have a contract. Contracts make for clear communication. And as we like to say, communication and clarity is kind. Clearness is kind. So how about you, Valarie? Do you guys have supervision contracts in your practice?
Yes, I think it's the one we have is outdated. I don't love it. It's not bad. I've just, over the years, I've realized, there's two supervisors. There's myself. And I feel like, I feel like it doesn't encapsulate. I feel like the supervisor and I need to get together, and we've been doing this because we're both going through the ACS course. I think we need to establish what parts of this do we want to be center-wide contract specific type things, and then what sorts of things need to be specific to her as a supervisor and then specific to me as a supervisor. And that became more apparent to me as I started going through the ACS course and reading over different things that some of the authors have in their contracts. And so the one I have, I think is very basic in certain ways. It is, we did go in and put things that are specific to our practice, but as we've evolved and changed different things and have more experience supervising people, there's just a lot of things that I now want to go back and revisit. So we're working on that.
Yeah, I think also, though, I would say that it's important to not get too deep in the weeds. Because you want
That's what my attorney always says with every single piece of paperwork I do, Amy, is he's like, you can't cover all the things, Valarie. And I'm like,
So let's talk about for a minute what the purpose of the contract is, because it's not designed to cover all the things. Because there are going to be, the purpose of, so let's talk about what the purpose of it is. Well, let's go back first and say, does Tennessee require one for supervision?
Yes.
Okay. So do they give you a template?
No.
So they don't give you a template, but they require.
And let me just be clear. I'm assuming they do because I've had training in supervision but from a state law standpoint, I would have to go back and actually look. I don't know. I think the NBCC requires one.
No, they don't.
For supervisors. Do they not?
No, that's a state by state thing. So Virginia requires that you have a contract, and you in fact must submit the contract when you apply for supervision.
Oh yeah, so no, we don't have anything like that.
You have to complete the contract. You have to have a signed contract with your supervisor before you apply for supervision. But the funny thing is that if you change supervisors during your supervision, you don't necessarily have to fill out a new contract or cancel the current one on file. So kind of dumb.
So it's almost like they're just checking a box versus doing real quality control.
Right. So I'm very serious. If I terminate with a supervisee, I send in a letter to the board saying I've terminated, because essentially from my perspective, you're still hanging out there on my license. And if I'm not working with you anymore,
I could see that for sure. It makes me wonder. I don't know. Now I'm going to check because I honestly just did it because I felt like that was what I was taught to do in supervision trainings. And
Yes.
I thought that that was laid out in the code of ethics.
So best practice is that that there is a contract, and so yes. So the goal of the contract is to guide the connection and communication between the supervisee and the supervisor, and to lay out the relationship expectations between both parties. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you think about it from that perspective, it doesn't need to encompass all of the things that, for example, an employment relationship might encompass, which is maybe where some people might get deep into the weeds, because it can't possibly just your relationship, you can't possibly get into all of the nuances of a more detailed employment kind of contract. And keep in mind that you may not be employing this person. You are just developing a contract that's going to guide your expectations for how we're going to go along together. And
Right.
so you are creating something that broaches that relationship, and sets clear expectations for how we're going to work together and what that's going to look like. So,
Mm-hmm.
so when you kind of think about that and put that in perspective, does that make it feel a little less like, oh my gosh, I don't feel quite so overwhelmed by it, or does it still feel like,
Um,
oh, I gotta wrap my teeth around this big elephant?
no, I think that ours like fits, it suffices, like for the basics. What I think is missing or needs to be addressed is, for instance, I really believe that like the supervision frame, like as far as like the theory and like how I supervise, I think in our current contract that's very much based on me and not based on my other clinical supervisor. And I think there needs to be discussion about her strengths and mine, and what's different about that, and where the frame she works from versus the frame I work from. So it's almost like an informed consent in that way. And I feel like we gave the company informed consent, which we have a company, and then we have an addendum for each therapist. It's almost like I feel like we moved my private practice informed consent to a group practice and added a therapist, but didn't add an addendum. So that's the one part of it. And I think the other piece of it is setting some requirements around what is expected in supervision and the
Right.
engagement of that. Because one of the things that I've realized is, much like a therapist with a client, clients don't understand the therapeutic process. The therapist holds that as the expert role. Same with supervision. And so it really has dawned on me that I don't know that my supervisees have always known how to engage supervision well and how to make the best use of supervision, because that wasn't told to them. It was
Right.
assumed they knew, much like a lot of things. And I've understood now over time, if are going to engage in this relationship, it's probably really important to state, here's what works well, here's what we expect, because otherwise they get it confused and they can try to come in there and vent for a whole
Right.
hour, and that's
Right.
not supervision.
Right.
So I think there's things like that that we could speak to with a little more clarity to really help set that frame for them, and then go over that in detail with them. Those are the things that I would like to cover better. And some of the things like, if this starts to happen, this is the steps we'll take. Like, we've had people who didn't seem to want to engage in supervision. They seemed almost frustrated that they had to be in supervision. And I would love for something to state, hey, the state of Tennessee requires it. If you're employed, we don't require that. It's the state. However, if you are showing signs that you're not engaged, we may recommend that you seek supervision outside of us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a couple things I would suggest too that we add that we don't have, and I'll certainly mention them. So in sort of thinking about that idea of like individualizing the contract. So yes. So one thing that is sort of like the thing that starts the contract, and this is sort of what's recommended and best practice, is that your contract starts with a description of you as a supervisor.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're kind of trying to describe is sort of sounds like the informed consent. So
Right.
it's really sort of saying, like, here's my name, here are my credentials, here's where I got my degree, here is what my degree is, here is my um, here is my how I approach supervision. Here is how this might be my philosophy or modality of supervision practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is really an outline of kind of my approach to this work of an art, really, of supervision. And that's really kind of like a nice paragraph in the beginning. It also includes your license number, again, your
Mm-hmm.
credentials, your contact information. Like, that's sort of the opening gamut. That's like the first paragraph there in the very beginning, all that information spelled out there at the very beginning. So that's like the first part of it. And so that would be the part that would be editable. Like, you would change that. So you'd have one, like all the other supervisors in your practice, that would change. That makes sense, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So then what you have after that are some other sort of like basics. So, at least in the Virginia, what they require is that, you list the work site of the place where the resident is going to be working. And then it goes into really, more the purpose of supervision.
Mm-hmm.
So it talks about the purpose of supervision, first and foremost, to ensure the welfare of the supervisee's clients, and focusing on promoting the supervisee's professional development, competence, and counselor identity. And then the particular contract that we have in Virginia really goes on to spell out some real specifics around outlining expectations and responsibilities of both the supervisor and the resident in accordance specifically with the regulations of the Virginia Board of Counseling. But what you would do, of course, is around the Tennessee Board of Counseling, or if you were a social worker, around the Social Work Board, or around the Psychology Board, or whatever those particular regulations are for your state. And you would outline those specifically there. So again, like, ultimately you're taking this document and you're putting all the expectations in writing, so there's just no gray area, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you put those there, that the purpose of supervision, like, really clear: to ensure the welfare of the supervisee's clients, focus on the training of the supervisee. Then I think that the coolest part of the contract, and I'm sure you do this, but I didn't hear you mention it, but I think the coolest part of the contract, and the part that you actually really might not be able to do in the very first meeting with your supervisee, but might take a couple, is developing goals and,
Mm-hmm.
really including those in the contract. Now, in Virginia, you usually don't like include these in the actual contract, because you usually just sign the paper and send it, and then you do the goals later. But you could, like, the goal, but I think the goals need to be really actually like legit goals, like robust, smart goals, like really where you think through them. And
Absolutely.
think about, like, I want my supervisees to actually come up with real goals for supervision, and they shouldn't be like, I want to get licensed, like, duh.
Mm-hmm.
um I want them to think about, what kind of training do you want to gain through this experience? What kind of um, environment do you want to build, for yourself clinically? What kind of, clients do you want to start to become, more comfortable with, that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
So that's really my favorite part, is the goal setting part. And I think a lot of people skip that because they go straight into the nitty gritty of, like, okay, let's talk about clients.
Mm. Yeah, we actually issue so we have a Google form that's just kind of like a baseline assessment, and it basically helps to establish the goals. Um We look at, like, we ask what populations they're most comfortable with, which ones they're most not uncomfortable with, what types of modalities are they most interested in learning more about. And it also assesses like their learning style. So we have like, I don't know, 5 or 6 different things that they can choose from, and they can select as many as apply. But things like, I like big books and I cannot lie, or can you just give me an infographic on that? Or can you explain that in a TikTok? Just because then it helps us understand the best way to reach them and kind of adjust some of that clinical material for them. And I really take those things into consideration when I am constructing things to do in group supervision, as I try to look at their different learning styles and what's really going to help them connect to the material. So it's interesting because we do that. And I put that in their supervision notes, but I don't think I go back and put that in the contract piece. But it does make sense that in some ways it would be like a treatment plan of sorts that you're working from, and that it would be important to capture it in that original document. But no, I haven't ever put it in there. I've only put it just in their supervision notes.
Well, I do appreciate the idea. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a contract, but I do appreciate the idea of the treatment plan. And I'm really also glad that you brought up the idea of notes, because we've had a lot of conversations in my practice around supervision notes and what supervision notes are supposed to encompass. Mm-hmm. And, if you don't put the goals in the contract, which, is neither really here nor there, having a plan in place for how the learning is going to progress is so important. And tracking that learning as you move through is such a big part of what we need to be doing. I'm just wondering why we are not all paying attention to that. So I think that's just note
if
to
I'm
self.
being honest, I just feel like, if I'm being honest, I feel that, for one, I was just looking over the state regs and I don't see anything about a contract for supervisors. There's probably 2 pages max, and they're not even full pages that they talk about supervision at the state level. So I don't even think that's required. But 2, they require the 12 hours. And then in your, every other year when you renew your license, 3 hours of that needs to be supervision training or something. But aside from that, I just need to say that I feel like there's not good standardized supervision prep, period. Unless somebody is getting a course in it, or a doctor, like, there is so much that is rich material that, to me, you can't put in a 1-day course. Like, you just kind of can't. And the ACS is like really showing me that. And so when you're missing all of those elements, I think that it just feels like a journey all by itself. And what I'm learning in this course is it's literally just a parallel process in so many ways to the therapy process without being therapy. But as far as like the engagement piece, the importance of the relationship between the supervisor and supervisee, like, there's so many beautiful parallels that we're already so equipped to doing. And yet it was not until I took that course that someone said, hey, spoiler alert, like, you already know how to do 90% of this. Let's just break it down on what it looks like here and how it's different from therapy so you don't cross over. I never got that in a supervision training. Instead, it was, you need to watch out for this and make sure you don't do this. And it almost felt like going to an ethics training where you walk out and you question everything and think you're doing everything wrong. And then you call your attorney and your attorney goes, what? Where do you get it? Where do y'all come up with this? Like, you were making this way harder than it needs to be. Like,
right, but don't
stop over documenting. Stop doing this. It felt, that's how the supervision training felt. It didn't feel candid, practical, and it just didn't give me what I needed, clearly.
Don't be fooled, though, because your ACS training obviously is really, really good. And that doesn't mean that trainings in general are not good. But don't be fooled that ACS in and of itself doesn't mean you're getting great supervision training. It's just 45 hours.
No, but what I mean by that is I am somebody who, I need a framework. Right. I need to see the big picture.
Wouldn't it be great if everyone had a framework?
Yes. And I did not have in the 12-hour course. And to be fair, I took one on managing supervision from a high risk perspective because we treat trauma. So in that way, it was very informative and helpful. But in terms of just being a clinical supervisor in general, I needed the big picture framework for what the space is that the supervisor holds and the value of that and the art of it. And I didn't get that piece. And I feel like had I gotten it, I mean, I'm only like halfway through this course and I already have so many ideas of things that we can do differently because I needed the big picture and didn't see it. So I went into supervision thinking it was literally make sure they don't do anything egregious and document it and kind of be a gatekeeper and get them to their hours. That was 100% what I thought the role of a supervisor was. And that was the only role that I thought they had. Isn't that sad?
And again, so much more. We probably should change the goal of our podcast because again, like, from gatekeeper to goalkeeper or something. I don't know, but that's like I think my end game.
You're a developer. To me, you're like water and you're like plant food and you're the nurturer of this plant. That's how I think of it.
It's
not
totally
to
my end
belittle
game.
people to a plant, but you know what I mean. Like you're helping them grow. You're giving them the environment and fostering it. You want to make sure they get enough light, that they're getting water, that you tell them, hey, you look parched. Like, to me, that's the role. Not that you just make sure they don't die.
Well, right. I mean, and again, like totally my end game is, to be known to be the person that makes sure that every supervisor feels empowered to play that part.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because if every supervisor feels empowered to play that part and feels happy to do it, then imagine what the next generation of clinicians would be like.
Oh my gosh, I know.
It's nobody's fault. I don't want to put any blame anywhere.
No.
It's
I
just
don't think
if you
so
don't
either.
know, like if you don't know, you could do that. If you don't know, like imagine if you don't know that you're not, you could have a bigger role than just keeping someone alive.
Right.
Like if you could have an inspirational role, if you could be a bigger, like if you could do that and you wanted to do that and you were empowered to do that and you were given the capacity, like you were, like allowed to have the capacity to do that, like imagine like how that would be. So anyway, that's my big vision. So
I'm curious though, real quick follow-up question, because this is something that I often ask of people who are interested in having a teaching practice. And I do have curiosity if you feel that this is the same with clinical supervision. I really feel like in my heart of hearts, if you don't have a love for education and educating others, like if you don't have any educator in you at all, then having a teaching practice is going to frustrate you and you're not going to flourish. It's not going to feel like a passion project for you. It's going to feel more like work than it is about a purpose and a passion. So if it's not you, someone in your practice needs to be that person. Do you feel that way with clinical supervision? Because I kind of do. I'm kind of feeling like if you don't love educating and growing people in general, like it's probably going to feel more like a chore than it is a calling. Or
1,000%.
Okay. Yep.
If you don't literally love teaching, you should not be doing it.
Thank you. And I feel like that should be the first thing that everyone in our field hears over again and over again and over again, because that's where I feel like harm comes in. And it's often, it's not intentional harm, but I feel like it happens in our school systems everywhere too, is there's teachers who have a love for teaching. And then there's some that just wanted summers off. Like, and
it's totally
and they're very different and they look very different and they're embodied in such different ways and their impact is very different.
Well, and that's one of the reasons, I mean, I know this is a little off topic, but that's one of the reasons why the clinical supervision directory has pivoted a bit, because I am so passionate about teaching and so passionate about supervision that when I started the directory, I was convinced then of course everyone feels this way. Everyone wants to supervise everyone. And so many people were like, Amy, I don't want any more supervisees.
Right?
And I was like, why?
I hear the same thing with interns. It's a lot of work. Like, it just didn't work well. And I'm like, but did you pour into them? Like,
And
it's
I'm like, why? It's so much fun. Like, why don't you want,
right.
like, I already have enough. And then I understand there's some states that limit it. And I was like, okay, I get that.
Yeah.
But then like, I already have enough. I don't want any more. And I'm like, gosh, why? And so now I get it so completely. And so it's kind of like that idea of like, you're supposed to feed your superstars. Like, you've got to feed the capacity of the clinician, of the supervisee, of the supervisor, in order for them to be able to want more supervisees.
Yes, I see. I
And
see.
so yeah, so that's it. Now if you want to be a supervisor, I'm 100% on your team. And if you don't, I'm still 100% on your team. Just don't do it. Don't do it. But I'm if you don't know this about me, you should know this about me. I am a person that I am either all in or I'm all out.
That's me, and that's why we get along so well.
Exactly. Like if you don't know that about me, you should know that about me. I am either 100% your hype girl or I do not like you at all.
My husband says my epitaph will say all go or no go. No middle.
Exactly. Now, you might not know I don't like you. I just might not hang with you at all. And I just will just keep it to myself because I'm not going to be that person that's just like rude. But
well, I'm not like that with people. I'm just like that with things in general. People,
okay.
I cannot like parts of you and still like other parts, but that's because I have the P and you have a J. So
yeah, well, that's just like when we were at the seafood restaurant and you're like, why are we going to a seafood restaurant? I do not do seafood. And I'm like, yeah, you're going anyway because it's literally a seafood town.
And you bullied me into it, and I'm so glad you did because it was such a great.
And then I'm literally like, Virginia Beach.
And you're like, you need to be around your friends. You work too much, and it was so fantastic because I'm like, I love friends that like make me do things because I wouldn't do them. Well, yeah, kind of like my husband. Like, I need somebody that's gonna call me on my shit, or else I won't grow. Sometimes you need that. Like, you have to prune your supervisees, and you have to prune your friends.
Well, so the bottom line is, like I'm either going to be all in or all out. And that's the thing with supervision. I'm all in and I want to encourage people to be all in. And so circling back to this like idea of the contract thing, when you're writing your contract with your supervisee, you need to be really clear that here are the expectations. And if you can't meet these, so, like I'm going to look back on the document here and there's a couple really clear things. Like I know that you do this and we don't in our practice. And that's because my clinicians get cringy. And so I backed off, but we do not videotape in my practice. And I know you do. And we'll talk about that in a second. Mm-hmm. But this contract, that is the example one that I have in my list of documents here, says you videotapes of supervisees counseling sessions. And I got so much pushback around videotape. People are so cringy about videotaping that I backed out of it. Now, if I was going to do videotaping, I would have to be all in, which means I have to push people past their comfort zone. And I wasn't really willing to do that. But again, like if you're going to have something in your contract, you have to be willing to say, you're going to do or die around this thing. You're going to do it, and it's in the contract, and I'm not going to let you out of it. Because when you do a contract with somebody and you don't follow through on all the pieces, what you're communicating is, this
I don't really mean
what
I say.
Yeah, and so that this isn't a value. But when you put something in, like I'm going to check your notes, we're going to be discussing ethics. You're responsible for showing up on time. And then you as the supervisee don't show up on time. Like all of those things communicate really, really important values. You are not all in.
Yes. Yeah.
So those are really, really important things when you're putting it out of contract to think about what are we communicating and how are we communicating in a clear enough way that says we're all in on this relationship and I'm invested in you and I'm expecting you to also invest in this.
That's right. And are they counting the cost? So same thing, like sometimes people don't count the cost. They jump into things. They don't understand what it takes. I think that's why we've waited to update ours, because some of the things that we do now, they're not in their contract. They are in their, for the people who work for me, they are in their job description. So if you're like a master's level counselor, quarterly tape submissions is going to happen. Or, and that's for everyone. And so, it was brought to my attention by my assistant clinical director, who's just brilliant. Of course, every good practice has the visionary and has the other one who's like very not visionary, but is holding it all together right there with you. And she was like, I wonder if they saw some sessions that you taped maybe. And I was like, well, I hadn't taped any. And I was like, you know what? I am very much of the mindset of I'm not going to ask anyone to do anything I'm not willing to do myself. Right. Ever, ever, ever. And so I let it be uncomfortable and ask a client that I've been working with for years. And I even thought to do it one time, didn't do it, and then did it the next session. So I even kind of chickened out that first time and thought, this is good for me, because I need to feel what they feel. And I need to get confident in scripting and stating and asking and explaining why I do this, because that's going to help me help them. And it was really exciting to be able to say, I did this, intervention with this person, and I recorded this session so that they can use it. And you just saw their faces kind of light up a little, like, oh, cool, we're going to get to watch that, and I thought that is the collaborative mindset. And that's what I feel like for those who work with me, I want on my team. But even for outside supervision, like I would love to have things that we can pull from, and right. That's kind of how we have our recording consent stated is they can choose different variations of privacy with that recording consent, so that we can use parts of that in other ways, in a teaching way. Because again, like there's so much power in the group and the different ways of seeing it. I think that, clinicians grow so much sometimes just by seeing other ways of doing things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you're right. You have to go all in, and tape coding and like reviewing sessions. It takes a lot of time. So like in my own vision, I'm like, once a month I want to tape. But then when you look at the capacity that it takes, you realize that's really not feasible.
Yeah. A couple other things that I think it's important to mention that are in the contract. So emergency procedures need to be in your contract. So in case of an emergency, you and your supervisee have discussed and agreed upon a procedure that is going to be practiced in the case of an emergency. Is that something that you guys discussed?
Mm-hmm. Yes, mine is call Valarie.
Ah, okay.
And the reason is a lot of times, the state does require that part. They do require that there be something written. The reason being is understanding the nervous system and understanding that if you have gotten your first suicidal client where you really think there's some real risk, or somebody has like anything, I know what's going to happen in your brain. You know what's going to happen. I'm not sending you to the staff room to pull a notebook to read some stupid papers and hope, like, as you are so dysregulated, you can't see straight. I just want you to call me. Just call me so that I can be on the phone. I can walk you through it. I can help co-regulate. And I am here to tell you, of all the years of doing supervision, generally one time only with each supervisee is there a moment like that. And from that point on, they are ready to handle it on their own. But I really think it's because it's not a traumatic experience for them when it happens.
Yeah. We have a policy in our practice that if you call, so we have Slack as our back end texting system, but if you call someone in our practice, they have to answer. Like that's just the rule. So if you call someone, no matter what, and if you call your supervisor, they have to answer also, of course. But if you call someone, or if I call you or you call me, we have to answer. So,
right.
Yeah.
And
so
then you also have to provide, like I would say to those listening, this is important because I've had to navigate this and realize this after the fact. Yes, call Valarie is the thing, but that also means that when Valarie works during the day, I have my phone on do not disturb.
Right.
So I've had to state, okay, during these hours, my phone's on do not disturb. you need to message me in the chat because I'm on the computer working. Or, hey, I'm out of town this week for all my supervisees. But what I am doing is turning off do not disturb so that I can be available by phone since I won't be on the computer as much. So it's very important to plan for those absences, because if that's the plan and you're out or the next point person's out and you didn't create another one, I mean, that's not, again, it states that you're not considering their needs and being all in. And so you can't really hold them to that same standard.
Right. You have to walk through the nuances. So like one of our interns said something like, well, I knew you were out of town. I'm not their supervisor, so it was okay. And I said, I was out of town, but I was not out of office on the calendar, which meant that I was available. So it's very clear to know out of office means one thing. You just knew I was out of town. That didn't mean I wasn't working. And so, like, again, there are a lot of nuances, especially when the supervisor is the business owner. But ask these questions. If you're a supervisee, ask the question, what if you don't answer the phone? What if it goes to voicemail? What if I am really an emergency and I can't reach you? Do I call 911? Do I call someone else? Do I ask all the questions? Because, you need to know that. And like in our practice, we have Noom, which is an app that you can press that will dial 911 if you feel unsafe. Get all of those things.
We have panic buttons. We just tell them don't use it unless you want a SWAT team, because the SWAT team's coming if you hit the panic button. But it's there, and we have them.
Police are coming. Duration and termination are something to include in there.
Another thing how often is it that you don't talk about duration? I'm sorry, that has bit me many times, and I say that because, again, I really have a distortion often of competence, and I forget how I learned what I learned, or I just assume everyone is like me. I think a lot of people do that sometimes. So to me, I've assumed that every supervisee that I engage with understands exactly how many hours they have, exactly approximately how long that takes, because they've mathed it. No, they have not. So they get all their direct hours and indirect, and they get super excited because they're like, I'm almost ready to be licensed. And I'm like, no, you're not. No, you're not.
Not anywhere close.
Did you count your supervision hours? No, not yet. Count those. And then they're like, you see their face just fall. Or I've had them where they're like, I don't think I'm getting enough supervision hours because I need to be licensed in a year. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? You're looking at an average of at least 2 years and probably more like 3. And then their face is like, it looks like they've never heard that before. So I want to stress to everyone listening, your supervisees do not know this information. Do not assume that they do. Even if they've been told 5 times, unless they are perfectionistic by nature and very rule follower, which is the very small margin of people that you probably have, they have no clue. Yeah. And they need to know.
Map it. Yeah, we map it all out. You have a minimum number of months in Virginia. You have to do it in a minimum of 21 months and then maximum of 4 years. So 2 more things I want to add. We don't have a lot of time left, but I don't want to skimp on these things. One of them is scope of practice of the supervisor. So if there are certain areas of your practice as a supervisor that you feel might be outside your scope, those should be included in your contract so that it's clear to your supervisor, to your supervisee, that if there are areas where, for example, one of them, this is not true for me, but this is a common one. For example, custody issues. If that is outside your scope of practice, custody issues should be included. Sexual assault is one that's commonly
eating disorders.
Disorders commonly outside of many people's scope of practice.
I feel like trauma.
Totally appropriate. It's okay if you don't have to be all things to all people.
That's
totally
right.
Okay to exclude, but put that in there so that looks like we need to case consult with a colleague. Guess what? That's what the CSD is for. Go there, find a colleague, grab them, say, hey, my supervisee needs a little support. Can we grab you for a half hour to get a little bit of help? And that is totally okay. That is why we're at the top of the pyramid.
Yes. And the value that you give a supervisee when you do that. When I have done an outside consult with someone and booked something so that they could help us maybe understand a test result because I was kind of sure but not sure enough and we needed more, the appreciation of that supervisee, like the value that gives them. Not only that, but you're modeling exactly how things should be handled clinically. And leaders always go first. They should. And so to me, I think it is the most beautiful example of modeling to a supervisee exactly how to handle complexity by showing them that you're not all things to all people and you don't know everything. But what you do know is you do know how to pivot and how to ask for help and how to seek it, and you're normalizing it, which I think will feed a clinician for their entire career.
Modeling
Just
that collaboration.
That experience. Yeah.
Absolutely. Last but not least, and I'm going to give you a teaser that we're going to be having a guest in the next maybe, month or so, who is a colleague of mine, who I will give you more information, Valarie, as it gets closer, who actually did her doctoral, she contributed to an article in her doctoral studies on this topic. So she is a colleague of mine. She teaches at George Mason University. She used to work in my practice. She's phenomenal on broaching around cultural diversity in your contract with your supervisee.
Oh my gosh, I cannot
I know
wait.
It's going to be really fantastic. Her name is Dr. Shakira Melchior.
Yes, such a
and
need.
She's going to come on our podcast and she's going to talk specifically about this. So this is last but not least, another the final area that I want to just mention real quickly to include in your contract. And it is the idea that you have had a conversation around cultural diversity, equity, inclusion, around all areas with your supervisee, to be clear about your own lived experience and the lived experience of your supervisee, so that you have had an open and honest conversation, so they know that where you are coming from, particularly if you are the supervisor and you are the business owner.
Yeah.
But they know where you are coming from, you know where they are coming from, and you have broached in a way that is super transparent from the very, very beginning. And that is also, if nothing else, it's a checkbox on your contract, but it should be much more than that, and a much more, in-depth conversation. And so we're going to be having several guests around that, but particularly I'm excited to hopefully snag Dr. Melchior to come and talk about that, because her article that she contributed to was excellent. And so I think that it will be a really great reference for us to have. So that's something that also to think about, and not something that is on any contracts. None.
Man, I cannot agree more. And now you just sparked mine. I'm like, oh, I bet you I could get somebody else who could speak to this and is over the counseling department at a local university and probably could bring some added value to that conversation, which I think is very needed.
We'll definitely be in the ACES best practices when we publish those in the fall. So that's a big part of what we have been talking about as well. Is an important conversation to be having early on.
Which also makes me think about spirituality, honestly, as a disclosure of sorts, and just like with any other informed consent.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, how is this used? How is it not used? Here's where I'm coming from, and here's how that can be of assistance potentially, and yet limiting in some ways or whatnot.
Absolutely. Well, we hope that this dive into supervision contracts was helpful to all of you. We will happily be giving you a reference to a supervision contract in the show notes. And we want to thank you for tuning into Supervision Simplified today. Remember that the revolution starts with you. Don't forget to subscribe to our exciting podcast and share it with your network. We're eager for your comments, stories, your feedback, your own contracts, to ensure that we're hitting the topics that you care about. Keep simplifying and elevating your supervision game until our next episode. Thanks so much for joining us.
Bye.